Hey everyone, in this lesson we are going to learn about optionals, all right? First, an analogy. Imagine that someone comes up to you and gives you a box wrapped in brown paper. They tell you that it may or may not contain a cake. You can't see into the box, so you have no way of knowing whether or not there is indeed cake inside. There are obviously two options. You open the box and there is actually a cake inside, or you open the box and there is sadly no cake. This is essentially what optionals are in the Swift programming language. When a variable is marked as optional, then we are saying that it may or may not have a value. If it does not have a value, we say that it is nil. Nil is the absence of a value. One thing to note is if you are coming to Swift from Objective-C, is that this nil is different from in Objective-C. In Objective-C and other C-based languages, nil is a pointer to a non-existent object. However, in Swift, nil is simply the absence of a value. Before we look at how to declare optional variables, let's think about why a programming language would need optionals. In most languages, for instance in Java, it is possible to create a variable without initializing a value. But then what happens if you forget to set the value later? And then you try to use that value in code. You will most likely get the dreaded NPE, or null pointer exception crash. You won't know about this crash until runtime. With optionals, Swift is able to protect us from problems like this at compile time and alert us before it becomes a runtime issue. The default for Swift is that variables are non-optional, meaning that we have to either give it a value or mark it as optional. If we don't give a non-optional variable a value, then we will receive an error at compile time if we try to use it prior to initializing it, or in other words, giving it a value. And this will be at compile time, meaning we can reduce the number of runtime crashes. So let's see how we declare an optional variable. I'm going to create a new playground here. I'm going to open it up with a blank one and say next. And just going to put this on the desktop and call this optionals and say create. All right, I'm going to get rid of this variable here. And let's create our first optional variable, all right? So the way to do it is we just write out like we usually do. I'm going to call this variable optional string, and then we can say of type string, and then here is how we make it optional. We put a question mark, okay? So now we are saying that this variable called optional string may or may not have a string value. It could be a string or it could be nil, okay? So if I say print optional string and I run this, right now obviously we're getting nil because this was never initialized to a value. Now, if I say optional string is equal to, and I give this a string, and then we print it again, after we have assigned it a value, we see optional Johnny B printed out, okay? So this is important. Just because we gave it a value, it is still an optional type, okay? So string and string are two completely different types, okay? This one is, the string that we're used to. This is a string wrapped in an optional, all right? So you can kind of think of that box that we were talking about that may or may not contain our cake as the optional. It is wrapping what may or may not be there. And if we look at what is under the hood for an optional, if we say optional type optional. So these two lines of code here are the same. This is just the shorthand way of writing it. So if we click on optional here and we jump to the definition, we can see here that it is an enumerator, which we'll cover here in a bit, but it only has two cases, none and some. Okay, so the absence of a value and the presence of a value stored as wrapped. So then if our value is wrapped in an optional, how do we get the actual value? How do we get it so that if we run this and we say print, we actually get just printed Johnny B and not optional? We use the term unwrapping to refer to the process of retrieving a value from an optional. And there are a number of ways to do this, so let's go through them. The first and the simplest way that you might run into is to unwrap an optional using an exclamation point. This is called force unwrapping, and it's not generally a good idea. This is because an optional, since it may or may not have a value, and by force unwrapping it, we are saying to the compiler, hey, trust me, there is definitely a value in there. So then the compiler says, all right, man, you're the boss, and lets you run the app. But if you were wrong about there being a value, it's going to force unwrap it, get nil, and you're going to get a crash. All right, so use force unwrapping sparingly, and only when you know 1000% that there will be a value. So let's go ahead and show how this works. Let's make a couple of optional variables. I'm going to say var a of type optional int, var b of type optional int. And then we're going to go ahead and illustrate the force unwrapping and why it can be dangerous, okay? So before we give these any values, let's say we say let sum equal a force unwrap plus b force unwrap, okay? So what we're saying to the compiler is, hey, this variable a, trust me, there's a value in there, as well as with b. But if we forgot to actually initialize these with integers, then what happens? I'm going to run this and you'll see here we get a crash. Fatal error, unexpectedly found nil while unwrapping an optional value, all right? So this tells us that we have a problem somewhere. Where we expected there to be a value, there is not. All right, so if we do give these values, if we say a is equal to 4 and b is equal to 6, and we run this again, it works. You can see over here that the sum is 10, okay? But this is dangerous. Only use this sparingly and when you absolutely know that there will be a value there, all right? The safer way is what is called optional binding. With optional binding, we perform a check to see whether the optional has a value. If it does, then we can use that value. And the way that we write this is like this. We say if let number is equal to a, our optional integer, then here we can use number. Okay, so if I say print number and we run this, then here we see 4. It is no longer optional, right? So we have unwrapped the value inside of a if there is a value, and then we will assign that to this temporary variable called number, and then here inside of the if let we have access to that unwrapped value. Now for instance, if we don't have a value, if I comment this out, then our a variable is nil because it doesn't have an initializer. So this part here, this print number, this will actually never be called. It will check to see if there is a value, and if there is not, then it just continues on its way. So if I run this again, you'll see here, I'm going to also need to comment this line out. So if I run this again, you'll see here that we don't have any print statement here, and that's because this was never reached because a was nil. Okay, so this is the safe way of unwrapping optional values, or at least one of them. The next way, so I'm going to put a comment here, this is optional binding. And an important thing to remember with optional binding is that this number variable here is only available inside of this statement. If I tried to use print number out here, then we're going to get an error because this doesn't exist outside of this if let statement, okay? All right, now let's look at guard let, okay? So guard let. This is probably my preferred method of unwrapping optionals, and you do it like this. We say guard let, and then we say the name of our temporary variable that we want. Guard let number is equal to a, and then you say else, and then you need to return, okay? So what we're doing here is we are saying if a has a value, assign it to number. Else, you're going to return. And we're getting an error here because you can't return outside of a function. So let's go ahead and put this inside of a function. We'll say func get number a, and then we'll go ahead and put that here inside. And then the great thing about guard let statements is that you have access to, oh, forgot the parentheses. The great thing about guard let is that you have access to the unwrapped value anywhere in the rest of the code. The bad thing is, or at least anywhere inside of the scope of that code. So anywhere inside a function, we have access to number. The bad thing is that if you had more code down here, if there is not a value inside of a, then you're going to return immediately out of this function and none of the rest of your code will be run. And I said that's a bad thing, but that's not necessarily true, because that might be the exact implementation that you want to have happen if your optional does not have a value. And it's also perfectly fine to have these two variables be the same name. So we could also say guard let a, or let's do b this time, b equal b, else return. And I'm going to uncomment right here where we assigned a value to a. And then we can say print number plus b. And then if we call this get number a and run this, we'll see printed out 10. Now I'm going to comment these two out and show you that you can use multiple unwrappings in the same guard statement. So we can say guard let a equal a, b equal b, else return. Oh, I forgot the let right here. There we go. So if there's a value in the optional a, assign it to a. Also, if there's a value in the optional b, assign it to b, else return. And we'll say print b plus b. Okay, so anything that comes after a return in a function is not run. Okay, so this means that you are just returning immediately out of this function. Change that b to an a there. And if you needed other logic to occur if this was incorrect, then you could do more logic. You could say, for instance, print there was not values in either a or b. You can also do multiple unwrappings in optional binding with if let. You could say if let number is equal to a, let b equal b as well. All right, so finally we have the Nil Coalescing Operator. All right, sounds fancy, sounds complicated. It's actually super simple. All right, so let's have a optional string. We're gonna save our name of type string. And we can even initialize it with a value. We can say Johnny. And we can say print name, and then 2 question marks, and then a default value. Okay, so I'm gonna say Bill. All right, so what this is doing is simply saying if name has a value, if the optional name has a value, use it. Otherwise, use a default value. Okay, so one more example, we can say var actual name is equal to, and then we can say name, question mark, and then a default value, Fred. We can do this with any type. So we have our numbers up here, a and b. We can say var number is equal to a, and if there isn't one, then we can assign it another value like 0. And if we run this right here, we'll see printed out Johnny. But if we get rid of the initialized value and we run this again, we get Bill, because name didn't have a value, so it defaulted to the default value instead. All right, so that is optionals. It's not super bad. After you've just had some time to practice with it, it will start to sink in. And we went through what an optional is, how to unwrap it using force unwrapping, which is generally a bad idea. Don't do it unless you know 1000% that it has a value. We went through optional binding with if let, and this is probably the most common way that you'll see unwrapping. Its drawbacks is that the unwrapped variable is only available inside of the function. But the upside to that is that if you had more code after this if let check that you still needed run, even if there isn't a value in these two optionals, then that code will still be run. Conversely, with the guard let statements, you can unwrap a variable's value and use that afterwards. But the flip side is that if there isn't a value in the optional, then it's going to return directly out of that function. And then finally, we have the Nil Coalescing Operator, which makes assigning default values if the optional does not have a value super easy. All right, so hope you enjoyed this lesson on optionals, and this has been Johnny B, and I'll see you in the next one.